Today I'm going to begin the daunting task of reading Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. Based on the many numinous experiences I had while reading Answer to Job, I know that this is going to be a daunting task. And it will also be a daunting task to read the book with me. So I decided that in the interests of completeness and to help my audience understand what it is that we're doing, I'm also going to be reading from, and perhaps reading all, I haven't yet decided, a book by Edward F. Edinger, The Aion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. Dr. Edinger was a leading Jungian analyst of the 20th century. He died in 1998, but among other credits, he founded the C.G. Jung Foundation and Institute in New York City, and he practiced Jungian psychology for decades. Dr. Edinger's work is exceptionally valuable in understanding the depth of Dr. Jung's work over his lifetime. So this first video will not be from Aion at all, but rather from Dr. Edinger's work, the Aion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. This set of lectures is edited by Deborah A. Wesley of Los Angeles. Dr. Edinger writes this author's note. Truly it can be said that Jung's Aion led the foundation for a whole new department of human knowledge, a scholarly discipline that one might call archetypal psychohistory. It is based on the application of the insights of depth psychology to the data of cultural history. The historical process can now be seen as the self-manifestation of the archetypes of the collective unconscious as they emerge and develop in time, and space through the actions and fantasies of humanity. In Aion, Jung took the archetype of the God image, the self, as his subject and demonstrated how it has revealed itself progressively in the course of the Christian Aeon. It is an awesome work that makes great demands on the reader. The present book is an attempt to mitigate this difficulty and to make Aion somewhat more accessible. I thank Deborah Wesley warmly for her skill and devotion in editing this difficult material. Edward F. Edinger, Los Angeles. On the next page, Dr. Edinger has put an image of the Mithraic god Aion. This is dated as Roman 2nd and 3rd century. Now we get into Dr. Edinger's explanation of why I have to begin this series with his comments first. Preface. Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, is Volume 9, Part 2 of Jung's collected works. It is one of Jung's last projects, published when he was 76. It must be acknowledged at the start that all Jung's late works are very difficult. After his illness in 1944, when he had a new birth, so to speak, he decided he was going to write the way he wanted to. His readers would have to meet him where he was, rather than his going to great lengths to meet them where they might be. And that has put an extra burden upon readers of these late works. My intent is to make Jung's material more accessible to modern readers by expanding on its historical background and by showing how the self manifests itself psychologically in everyday experience. I suggest 3 guiding principles in reading Aion. The first is to recognize Jung's magnitude. Before starting the book, you should realize that Jung's consciousness vastly surpasses your own. If he puts something in a way that seems unnecessarily difficult, the proper procedure is to assume that he knows what he is doing and knows something you don't. If you make the assumption that you know better than he does and start with a critical attitude, don't bother. The book isn't for you. Jung's depth and breadth are absolutely awesome. We are all Lilliputians by comparison. So when we encounter Jung, we feel inferior and we don't like it. To read Jung successfully, we must begin by accepting our own littleness. Then we become teachable. Principle number 2 is to understand Jung's method. Especially in his later works, Jung writes about the psyche in what I call a presentational way, by which I mean he presents us with psychic facts rather than with theories about the facts. We are so used to living out of a conceptual context that we spare ourselves the encounter with the raw facts. And because we are not familiar with the psychic facts Jung presents, they seem alien and disconnected. Our task is to become familiar with the facts Jung gives us. As we gradually gain that familiarity, their interconnections and the whole presentational method become visible. This leads into a mode of thinking different from the usual. We are used to linear thinking, whereas the presentation of psychological facts by the method of amplification can be described as cluster thinking, in which one has a central image and finds a cluster of related images connected to it. Footnote: Dr. Edinger provides this image as an example of what he's talking about, a cluster image. Please stop the video in order to read this. It is important for us to become familiar with cluster thinking because this is the way to amplify and assimilate dream images. If we are not thoroughly comfortable in this mode of functioning, we won't be able to penetrate the meaning of dreams. Once past the first couple of chapters, Aion concerns themes and images of the objective psyche. I suggest that as you read the material presented in Aion, you ask yourself what theme is being presented. Jung's method is calculated to teach us to think thematically, so that when we perceive one theme of image, amplification of it leads to related images, and so on, into an increasingly larger cluster. The study of Aion can help the reader in learning how to perceive and extract the theme and image embedded in a body of material. Initially, this is not easy to do, but it is important because when one is presented with a dream and can't recognize its thematic content, one is lost. Associations can be elicited from the patient, but without recognizing the theme, one won't have anything to contribute. Locating the theme, one can then offer parallels. Principle number 3 is what I would call the Fruitcake Principle. By this I mean that you must read Jung the way you eat fruitcake, very slowly. The reading is exceedingly rich, exceedingly delicious, because it is the richness of the psyche itself which is being presented. But it is very concentrated, and especially so in Aion. Jung just alludes to vast areas of symbolic reference, because he does not want to write too long a book, and because these areas are so familiar to him, that it would be boring to him to spell it all out. He just alludes, and one has these kernels, these rich pieces of nut and heavy fruit, which have to be masticated and digested slowly in order to be appreciated. Aion can be assimilated only in very small bites. This means that one must read one sentence at a time and become familiar with every term and reference in that sentence. There is a great temptation when we encounter things with which we are not familiar to skip over them, thinking that the next sentence will explain what has been bypassed. This won't happen in Aion. If you skip unfamiliar materials in this text, you will soon be lost. So I urge you to work with a dictionary and an encyclopedia at your side. And whenever you come to something unfamiliar, look it up. This means that you will be looking into a Latin dictionary, and you will be looking into historical matters to a considerable extent, for Aion is in part a book about history. It is useful to realize that Jung is discussing the cultural history of the human race, as though it were the case history of a single patient. Jung has the entire record of that patient at his fingertips, but few of us do, which means we must fill our gaps as we go along. The decision to present this material began with a dream of my own in September 1987. Jung is speaking about his writing of Aion. He says that while he was writing it, he received a lot of criticism because of its content. However, he kept right on in order to complete his escrow account with history. Anyone who has bought a house knows what an escrow account is. An escrow is a written agreement, such as a deed or a bond, put into the custody of a third party, and not in effect until certain conditions are fulfilled. My dream tells us that Jung put Aion in escrow with history. It means that the grantees, the receivers of this volume, have to fulfill certain conditions before it will become available to them. We are the grantees, the receivers of this account with history. I think this means we have to work on understanding the book in order for the grant to take effect. Aion is just going to sit on library shelves unless or until the receivers of it fulfill the conditions necessary to understand what it means. We would all like Aion to become available to us to move into that new house, but it is still in escrow, so to speak. Jung, too, had a dream concerning Aion. In a letter to Victor White on December 19, 1947, Jung says, "Not very long after I wrote to you, I simply had to write a new essay. I did not know about what. It occurred to me I should discuss some of the finer points about anima, animus, shadow, and last but not least, the self. I was against it because I wanted to rest my head. Lately I had suffered from severe sleeplessness, and I wanted to keep away from all mental exertions. In spite of everything, I felt forced to write on blindly, not seeing at all where I was driving at. Only after I had written about 25 pages in folio, it began to dawn on me that Christ, not the man, but the divine being, was my secret goal. It came to me as a shock, as I felt utterly unequal to such a task. A dream told me that my small fishing boat had been sunk and that a giant, whom I knew from a dream about 30 years ago, had provided me with a new, beautiful seagoing craft about twice the size of my former boat. Then I knew, nothing doing, I had to go on. My further writing led me to the archetype of the God-man and to the phenomenon of synchronicity, which adheres to the archetype. Thus I came to discuss the Ichthys and the then new Aion of Pisces, the prophecy of the Antichrist, and the development of the latter from 1000 AD in mysticism and alchemy until the recent developments, which threatened to overturn the Christian Aeon altogether. Footnote, this is from Letters, Volume 1, pages 479 and following. Another comment concerning Aeon was made to Margaret Ostrovsky Sachs in a private conversation, which she recorded. Jung said to her, "Before my illness in 1944, I had often asked myself if I were permitted to publish or even speak of my secret knowledge. I later set it all down in Aion. I realized it was my duty to communicate these thoughts, yet I doubted whether I was allowed to give expression to them. During my illness, I received confirmation, and I now knew that everything had meaning and that everything was perfect." Footnote from Conversations with C.G. Jung, page 68. Editor's Foreword. More than a few readers have picked up C.G. Jung's Aion and then put it down again, overwhelmed by his flood of material from classical, Christian, Gnostic, and alchemical writers. It is not easy to bridge the various source materials and to follow the thread of Jung's thought, and there has been little to help readers through this rough terrain. Despite the importance of its subject, the changes in the God image during 2,000 years of the Christian era and its relevance as this millennium comes to an end, the book has not been widely read. Finally, in 1988-89, a guide to Aion appeared in the form of a series of seminar lectures by Edward Edinger. The audience was crammed into a lecture. You can see that the reading of these books definitely does touch some of my complexes. And listening to them will ultimately touch yours. The audience was crammed into a lecture room at the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles and consisted primarily of therapists in training to be analysts, with a scattering of analysts and interested lay people. The atmosphere was serious, but with an undercurrent of excitement. There were some questions and exchanges between members of the audience and Dr. Edinger. By and large, however, those present simply listened, eager for the clarification being brought to Jung's difficult work. This book is based on an editorial transcript of those lectures. Footnote, audio tapes are available from the C.G. Jung bookstore in Los Angeles. The particular forum in which the lectures were presented gave rise to a text that actually encompasses two somewhat distinct levels. Primarily, Dr. Edinger leads the reader through Aion chapter by chapter, explaining difficult references, extending and discussing quotations from Jung's source material, filling in background, and supplying examples. The reader will notice a second level. Many of Dr. Edinger's examples arise from analytical practice, and at times one realizes that one is in the presence of a master analyst teaching apprentices. There are numerous seminal remarks about the nature and practice of depth analysis. The text is supplemented by the diagrams used to illustrate the original lectures. They have been reconceived and redrawn from the author's original sketches by Thornton Ladd. For whose generous help and unfailing enthusiasm, I am very grateful. Deborah A. Wesley, Los Angeles. You may wonder why a silly old man is sitting in. You may wonder why a silly old man, retired Marine, retired executive, feels compelled to sit and read these books to you. Well, the feeling I have is very much like the feeling that Dr. Jung himself had when he wrote to Victor White in 1947, when he said, "I felt forced to write on blindly, not seeing at all what I was driving at. In spite of everything, I felt forced to write on blindly, not seeing at all what I was driving at." This is the same feeling that I have had as I prepared the Carl Jung Depth Psychology reading group, and as I read Answer to Job, and now beginning to read Aion. I began to read references to Jung's work in 1987, and I didn't actually read anything that he had written until 1990. But since then, through many you can see that I have quite a complex tied up with Dr. Jung's work. Since 1990, through thick and thin, every time I've been going through a rough time in my life, I've picked up some book of Carl Jung's, and I can turn it to any page and begin reading, and somehow it makes me feel better. I don't know why, but I do know that it has become a theme in my life, and now is one of the most important things that I am doing in my late life as my Escrow to history. I realized some years ago that I had almost nothing of my grandparents. I have my maternal grandfather's gold watch, and until I gave it to my younger daughter, I had my maternal grandmother's engagement ring. But that was all. That's all I have from them. So part of my rationale for doing these videos is that they are an escrow for my grandchildren, two of whom were born only 3 months ago on Father's Day. It was quite a Father's Day gift for me, their grandfather. So it's unlikely that I can have very much influence on their lives, except possibly through these videos. I hope you enjoy them.